Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're going to be continuing, inshallah, today with the evolution of Muslim thinking. We're a number of things that we need to speak about, of course. Who are these scholars, and specifically the hadith scholars? Why is that important? Because when you're speaking of hadith, you're actually speaking about the second source in Islam. You're talking about a reference in your deen. And the Prophet ﷺ actually said that every single person must know who that person that they're studying their religion, it really is. So when we look at the main characters, the most important scholars of hadith are Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Ahmad ibn Hanbal al-Nasa'i, at-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah. Just really fast, I'm going to talk about each and every single one of them, at least just in some brevity here, just so that at least we know who these scholars were. So when we look at Imam al-Bukhari, his name is Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. So that was his name, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari was born in Bukhara, and Bukhara is a city in Asia, in Uzbekistan. Currently in Uzbekistan, and so is Imam Muslim. Well, Imam Muslim Samarkand, but Samarkand is right now a province in Iran, and Bukhara is Uzbekistan and Bukhara within Uzbekistan and Iran, sorry, not India, Iran. So pretty much within that area. And by the way, that area was the hometown for most of the important scholars of hadith and even fiqh. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal was actually Muhammad ibn Hanbal or Ahmad ibn Hanbal al-Shaybani. He was actually Arabic, but of course, well, Shaybani, they're pretty much, that right now, the Saudi and Kuwait and Qatar and Qatar tribes until now. And Nasa'i was actually from the city of Nasa, but there are those scholars that actually said that Nasa'i was actually because he was married to many women, women, but that's not necessarily accurate. Tirmidhi was from a city, Turmuz, which is right now in Iran, and Ibn Majah happens to be the scholar, which many times, a lot of the hadith are not as authentic as the rest, but really important things to mention about Imam Bukhari. Imam Bukhari, he was blind. He was blind in his early age. He was not born blind, but he lost his sight at one point in his life. And then later, his mother takes him to Mecca, and while she's doing her Hajj, she decides to make the dua to invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to return her son's sight back. It's very important to say that Bukhari grew up with a single mother, and his mother was she was a very pious woman, and she had dreamed that her son would be a scholar. Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari later gets his sight back. His mother actually gets a dream that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was coming in her dream and informing her that her son was getting his sight back. He later gets his sight back, and then later goes and grows with his knowledge by getting and acquiring ilm from the neighboring scholars from the cities that are surrounding Bukhara, and that's where he expands his ilm in ilm al-hadith and also in what is called ilm al-rijal. Needless to say that when we speak about ilm al-rijal, although it sounds very misogynist, but it is not. Ilm al-rijal is basically the one side of ilm al-hadith. So ilm al-hadith actually has two sides of it. There's the diraya and there's the riwaya, and ilm al-rijal happens to be the study of men. So what you're really studying is really those profiles of the profiles of those chain of narrators, in order to make sure that report was really mentioned, and we've got good documentation about the men and the narrators, men and women. It includes men and women, but most of them are actually men. Those that narrated those hadith, we would have these huge profiles, profiles. I mean, you take, for example, one book, Kitab al-Kamal, is almost 38 volumes, 38 huge volumes, and that was actually a summary of even a bigger book that was almost 80 volumes. So you've got all these profiles, and al-Bukhari, by 16, he actually wrote his book called Al-Kashaf في علم الرجال. So Al-Kashaf, in where Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, by a young age, and this is really important, I always tell my children this, that when we look at the history of most of these scholars and hadith and fiqh and those great leaders, we always see that their education started from early childhood. From early childhood, they had mothers, they had fathers to mentor them in that path, to get that ilm, to get that knowledge, and to help them actually grow. Now, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari had his mother to mentor him, and later he stayed alone in Mecca, in where he continued to grow with his ilm al-hadith. And al-Bukhari himself actually travels many different places just to get ilm al-hadith. And his book becomes the second most important reference for Islam after the Quran. Now, his student who was actually Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj. Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj is not the Hajjaj, the famous al-Hajjaj al-Thaqafi. That's not the same one. But Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, he was actually from Samarkand, and his book, Sahih Muslim, is actually considered the third most important reference in Islam. When we look at Sahih al-Bukhari, very important to note that there are ahadith that are considered what is called mu'allaq, right? Let me write that down. So pretty much all the ahadith in it are actually sahih, all right? They're all authentic, but there are some narrations that are considered mu'allaq, which means that al-Bukhari, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, did not necessarily say all the chain of narration. He didn't note down all the chain of narration and just used one person within that chain of narration. Could be Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab, it could be al-Qanabi, it could be a Sahabi, Ibn Abbas, etc. And we'll say the quote. So these are not necessarily considered part of Sahih, but it is really important to mention that there later was this scholar, his name is Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who later gathered all those hadith that are considered mu'allaq. The word mu'allaq would mean that it's a broken chain of narration. He gathered all those hadith and researched and found all the missing links within those chain of narrations, and he called his book Taghliq al-Ta'liq. So it's like finishing or finding the missing links for those hadith. So having that being said, when you talk about al-Bukhari, when you talk about Sahih al-Bukhari, you're actually talking about a very sacred reference in Islam for the most authentic hadith. Sahih Muslim, there are some scholars that did consider that Sahih Muslim is more important than Sahih al-Bukhari, just to note down, especially the scholars of al-Malikiyya. They regarded North Africa. When I say Malikiyya, we're talking about North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania. Those are all Maliki, and parts of Libya as well. Those are all Maliki. They did regard that Imam Muslim's book is more authentic than Sahih al-Bukhari. But that's a lot to mention, just for Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Really fast, just a fast note. Imam Ahmad, Bukhari died 256 Hijriya, all right? And 264, I believe, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal died 261 almost, and in Nasa'i I think 310. Don't take my word on that. It's 303 or 310 Hijrah, and Tirmidhi was pretty much around that era as well. So when we look at the time lapse that they were in, you could see that it's pretty much second and third century, second or third and third century, around the third century, and that's like 200, well, 200 roughly 200 and some years after the Prophet ﷺ. And that's why when you look at some, roughly 200 something years after the Prophet ﷺ, and of course the Prophet ﷺ died 11-year Hijrah. The Prophet ﷺ dies 11-year Hijrah, and there were some Sahaba that went in different parts of the world. So those Sahaba took it upon themselves to teach whoever was present with them. And most of the times there were what are called il-mawali. Il-mawali just happened to be the ex-slaves that grew up around those. A lot of them were actually the Sahaba. So those mawali, they later became those scholars, and most of the scholars are actually from the ex-slaves. And this is really important to mention because a lot of the ex-slaves happen to be the major scholars later, in fact, were the ones to carry on Islam and actually teach it to others. This is not like the Western slavery where the slaves get slipped away from their rights, but right now we look at in Islamic history, il-mawali happen to be the ones to be the most educated, the ones to later become leaders, as in the era of al-Mamalik era. The mawali later became those to be in high positions in governance, and the list goes on and on. So from the year 11-year Hijrah until this era, you're like, okay, well, for sure there were a lot of Sahaba that had died, of course, because the last Sahabi that had died was around 96 Hijrah. So we're looking at some decades after the Prophet ﷺ, and almost, well, a century and a century and a couple of years. So that's why the 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 smaller the chain of narration, the less people there are in the chain of narration, the stronger that hadith becomes if the people in the chain of narration were proven to have the different qualities that we had talked about before. So the smaller the chain of narration, the stronger, the better, because then you would have less people and less of that transition from one person to another. So when we look at those chain of narrations, we would see that the first and the most important scholar that was closer to the era of the Prophet ﷺ was actually al-Muwatta. Al-Muwatta, and who is Malik ibn Anas. We're going to talk about Malik ibn Anas. All right, Imam Malik ibn Anas, Imam Dar al-Hijrah. Imam Malik was one of those earliest ones. Now, Imam Malik actually died 79-year Hijrah. All right, 79-year Hijrah, and Imam Malik did actually meet with a lot of tabi'in. Now let's look at this little chain right here. So we've got the Sahabi is the person that met the Prophet ﷺ. We've got and stayed Muslim. We have a tabi'i, and that is the person that met the Sahabi. Then we've got a tabi'i, and that is the person that met the Sahabi. All right. So Malik ibn Anas happens to be one of these people. In fact, he actually met some of the tabi'i, and even met some tabi'in as well. So you're talking about al-Muwatta, although written way earlier than al-Bukhari, but al-Muwatta in it contained a number of different things. There's what is called the hadith, and there's what is called al-athar. All right. So al-hadith is what was narrated about the Prophet ﷺ, ما صدر عن الرسول من قول أو فعل أو تقرير أو صفة. What was reported on the Prophet ﷺ all right? Whether that was something that he had said, something that he had done, a report, a description on the Prophet ﷺ, versus an athar would be attributed that the Sahabi was the one that said it. It was the Prophet's companion that said it. It was the Prophet's companion that quoted this item. And then we would have the athar where there is al-mawquf and there is al-marfu'. All right? Where there is al-mawquf and there is al-marfu'. What is the difference? So al-athar can be something that the Prophet ﷺ, he taught the Sahaba, but that athar, which is the quote that the companion had said, that quote could be that he's attributing it to the Prophet ﷺ, which is al-marfu', so it is more likely that he got that information from the Prophet ﷺ. In other words, even though he didn't say, well, the Prophet ﷺ said such and such and such, he just said, well, for example, this is what happens on Judgment Day. Well, absolutely, the Sahabi would not know what is going to happen on Judgment Day if he did not actually get it from the Prophet ﷺ. So that would take what is called marfu', meaning that it's more attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, even though it was a Sahabi, so we would regard it as marfu'. And there's the mawquf, which is what was said that is actually, the Sahabi's words. It could be his interpretation, it could be what he had thought, it could be something that he himself had learned from the Prophet ﷺ, but not as a quote. So that would be called al-mawquf. All right. So just some items to relate to the things around us. Are we really talking about something really near? The documentation in hadith did actually happen early. Like we said, we've got al-muwatta. Al-muwatta was the Imam Malik was actually died in 79 Hijrah. So you're not looking at very distant times. Imam Malik was actually living in Medina. And that is why Imam Malik, because he was living in Medina, that's why he was capable of getting a large number of Sahaba that he was learning from, and including Tabi'in. So I want you to keep note those Tabi'in and Tabi'in, because we're going to come across that later on. So the other question, what is the third resource of Islamic thought? When we look at the third resource of Islamic thought, it's basically called ijma'. What does it mean when we say ijma'? Well, what does it mean to say ijma'? So ijma', it just simply means that there was a unanimous agreement, and the unanimous agreement of the mujtahideen. All right. So it was really the scholars that had researched this matter, and they considered and they came to the conclusion that this is what all the mujtahideen, all the scholars had actually agreed upon in any period. So any period of time after the Prophet ﷺ, that there was a group of scholars. But here's the thing, is that it is really rare to get that ijma'. It's really rare to get that ijma', but that's why scholars would base the ijma'. It's not that, oh yeah, we agreed and that's basically it, but there would actually be a reference. There would be a reference to quote that there was a consensus, a unanimous consensus regarding that. There is something called al-ijma' al-sukuti, which is more of a silence consensus, meaning they didn't say anything about it, but everybody was taking it as if it was by default the case in Islam. So some scholars would regard that type of that was by default. Everybody didn't say anything about it. So let's take an example. An example to it, you've got let's say women making the adhan. All right, the Prophet ﷺ, yeah, we'll share the handout, inshallah. The Prophet ﷺ, there were women during his era, and it was something that he could have called on one of those ladies and said, you know what, I would like you to do the adhan. But the Prophet ﷺ, can we find a text where the Prophet ﷺ said that women, ladies, we don't want you to do the adhan? No, you're not going to find any text. So how can we prove that the Prophet ﷺ or Islam forbid that women to be the mu'addin? Well, there's number one is that there is, when we talk about a sunnah, all right, there are two types of sunnah. There's the sunnah fi'liya, where it is something that the Prophet ﷺ actually did. And there's a sunnah tarkiyya, something that the Prophet ﷺ had left, in other words, did not do, even though all the different factors to have that happen were actually there. But the Prophet ﷺ never did it. So that would be sunnah tarkiyya. But sunnah tarkiyya meaning that the sunnah is to leave that matter. So the Prophet ﷺ, by him not doing it, even though there were women present, he had definitely a number of wives, and there all the different areas, so he could have probably assigned one guy. You know, he had Abu Mahdura, he had Bilal ibn Rabah, he had Ibn Maktoum. He had a number of guys do it, but he never asked a woman to do this, or even a woman to lead men. So in that situation, we would say, well, let's see also another addition, which is al-ijma', which is the consensus that all scholars agreed, even though they didn't necessarily quote it, they didn't necessarily sit at a table and say, hey, we all agree. How many people agree? Raise your hands and let's count those. Let's count how many people agree on this. But we would say, well, there was also al-ijma' al-sukuti. There was also a unanimous agreement that it was by default. They did not, throughout history, actually have a woman do the adhan as a complete practice and an implementation to what the Prophet ﷺ had done himself during his era. So now we would have a chain from the time of the Prophet ﷺ to later the scholars looking at the Sunnah and looking at the Quran and saying, well, by default, this is what we're seeing. And as scholars, we have reviewed these resources, and now we could come to a final consensus that yes, by default, we don't have anything that allows such and such to happen or not to happen, or this is what Islam states. So, but here's the thing, is that ijma' is very, very little. You don't always have ijma', and for ijma' you would have some reference. Some scholars, there were some books that collected the different ijma'at, the different consensus that were out there. I don't want to take you guys into all these different references. Now, like I said, it is rare, but there are some textual references that will count those ijma'as and actually take you there. So the other part, what is the fourth resource for Islamic thought, and how is it applied? When we look at the fourth resource, we're actually talking about what is called qiyas. Now, the word qiyas in analogy, it's not a personal analogy. We don't use personal analogy in order to decide what we think of it. So literally, you're actually measuring or determining the quality of something. This is just the literal part. But in Islam, what we're actually talking about is that you're establishing a similarity. You're establishing an equality. You're establishing a ruling. Okay, you're establishing a ruling by looking at the similarity between two things. But the similarity that you're looking at is not. Let me just zoom in right here, because this is really important to mention, is that the similarity is not according to you and I, but we would actually look at what is called al-illah. Al-illah is not the wisdom. Al-illah is different than what is called al-hikmah, because al-illah would mean that I would have to have illah mansusa, I would have to have some reference that is the reason why such a matter is halal or such a matter is haram. I would have to have something that indicates the reasoning behind that particular legislature. So we would look at that effect, and we would then say, well, if they had that commonality, then therefore they have the same conclusion. Let's give an example. The easiest example is about drinking and drugs. All right. Well, drugs, although they did exist during the Prophet ﷺ, but not maybe the sophisticated type that we have today. But they still had drugs. They still used some certain items, which today, for example, what is called GAT in Yemen and in Somalia, and that gave them the same exact result that marijuana would have, which is, ecstasy and that and getting high, etc. In other words, they did have those drugs, but the Prophet ﷺ, during his era, it was more common to use drinking as a type of as a way of getting high and a way of getting drunk. So in Islam, the Prophet ﷺ actually made it clear that every single matter that leads to intoxication, that leads you to losing your focus, you not being sober enough, etc., that would mean that matter and that substance is actually haram. Meaning what? The Prophet ﷺ said every single matter that leads to intoxication is haram. Meaning that every single matter, whether that was called alcohol, whether that was called beer, whether that was called wine, whether that was later called brandy and who knows all the different names of alcohol, or whether that was a different type of substance, but it leads to the same result. Whether that was called cocaine, whether that was called GAT, or whether that was called marijuana, whether heroin, hashish, whatever it is, all of it is going to be taking the same exact ruling which the alcohol had taken, which is that it's haram. And in fact, it can even be a lot more haram, because we could see that the amount that you might consume of heroin, it could be just a small gram, and it could even lead to a more intoxication than alcohol. That would mean that it can even be considered even more haram. So who's the person that does the qiyas? Well, the person that does the qiyas is the scholar by looking at what is called al-illa. So when we look at القياس الحاق فرع بأصل لاشتراكهما في علة الحكم. So in Arabic, in English, where what it means is that you're actually taking a ruling. There's an original thing. So there's the al-asl. There's the original ruling that we have in Islam. And then we've got something that we're trying to apply. And this is most common in what we call in nawazil. In nawazil are basically the new issues that were not during the Prophet ﷺ. So these nawazil, these issues, because they are new, we would look at qiyas, we would look at understanding al-illa. We would look at the reasoning behind that ruling, and in order to figure out this new matter or this new issue, it doesn't have to be food, it can be different matters, but note, you do not do qiyas in ibadat. You cannot do qiyas in ritual. So you can't say, well, during hardship, we would basically do our salah this way. So right now, we'll do the same thing because we happen to be busy. Even during ease, we can do the same thing. Why? Because we're busy. And we can't say, well, the common part is that we're busy. The during hardship, because we were busy with other things, so during ease, let's do that qiyas and say, well, the same commonality is that we're both busy. Therefore, the result is we can do jama', or we could do that combining salah, etc. You cannot do qiyas during salah, in ibadat. So in ritual would mean whether we're talking about salah, or whether we're talking about zakah, or whether we're talking about siyam or hajj or umrah, those are ritual. There is no qiyas. You cannot do qiyas in any of those. Qiyas is only done on matters that we understand the reasoning behind it, and the reasoning is actually based on a text. It's not based on your own inclination. We would need to assign. There would be those scholars that are mujtahideen, that are qualified in order to see the reasoning behind such ruling. So it's not an issue of wisdom. All right, al-hikmah is a totally different thing. We don't base the ruling on what is the wisdom behind it. So we can't say, well, let me do my qiyas here, and the reason and the wisdom behind hijab was because, well, the ayah says ذَلِكَ أَدْنَى يُعْرَفْنَ فَلَا يُؤْذَيْنَ. Here's the wisdom, that it is in order for them to be recognized for their identity, and that way they won't be harmed. And somebody might say, well, right now we've got police officers everywhere. The women can actually right now be protected by teaching them martial arts. So now let's do our qiyas. Well, since women are not right now as much in danger as during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, because they can call the emergency hotline number and they can be trained in martial arts. Now they don't have to wear hijab anymore. False qiyas. All right, this is a false qiyas. You cannot use the hikmah. The wisdom behind the matter is different than the illah. The illah is the reasoning behind that. All right, not the hikmah. Not because al-hikmah can be relative. We can have different views. We can understand things differently, but al-illah is specifying. It is really specific to tell me this is the reason why for that particular ruling, and that's how we understand it. So how does qiyas work? We just mentioned it. There are essential requirements for qiyas. We have to have the original part, which is al-asl, and the asl, we're going to have al-fara', which we're seeking the ruling for. All right, and then we're going to look at the commonality between these two, and then we're going to finally bring about the final ruling regarding that new case, and we're going to bring about a new statement, which is the ruling. But can we necessarily have differences of opinions in issuing? Yes, you can, but it's not you, it's actually scholars. And we talked about the alcohol and the drugs and how we actually got the final issue on the final fatwa that alcohol is haram or drugs are haram because alcohol is haram. Let's go for another part. When we look at, so this is question 7, what are the principles that determine the rulings of Sharia? Although, yes, all those different notes that we had mentioned, there are actually a lot more to them, but this is just one side. Those are just some of those sides, all right? But there are general principles in Sharia. Let's quote this. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim actually said, الشريعة مبناها وأساسها على الحكم ومصالح العباد في المعاش والمعاد وهي عدل كلها ورحمة كلها وحكمة كلها ومصلحة كلها. This is really important to note, is that the whole base, the whole foundation behind Sharia is it's actually based on the wisdom and achieving people's welfare in this life and the afterlife. Sharia is all about justice, mercy, wisdom, and good, in other words, piety in general. Any ruling that replaces justice with injustice, mercy with its opposite, common good with mischief, or wisdom with nonsense is a ruling that does not belong to Sharia, even if it is claimed to be according to some interpretations. Now, what do we get out of that? That there's generally, we would look at the Quran and the Sunnah, and there are general principles, there are general maxims in Islam. In every single philosophy of ethics, there's always the idea, well, what makes a priority? What makes something as a common right? What is justice based on? Who decides and who considers what justice is on a social and individual level? Do we consider the individual right and freedom more important than the group, common society, etc.? What is a bigger priority? And those generally can be combined in an acronym I always use, which is DNAIM. Whenever you want to explain Islam, you have to memorize these, and in this order, just like you would memorize your own name. This is the DNA of Islam, the DNA. And I'll tell you, once you get this understood, then you will understand the vertebra behind every single legislature in Islam, and you're able to answer most of those questions, even in your life, by memorizing these parts of the acronym. What does it mean? So in Islam, there's your deen and the individual, and for each and every single one of these, the individual and also the society. The society's spirituality is the first and most important priority. This is number one. The society's life and is securing the individual and the society's life and granting them the space to have those protected is the second priority, mind. And when we speak about mind, we're talking about in its health, mental health, and also in the education. That is considered the third priority. Fourth, chastity. But scholars, by the way, just to note, scholars had differences of opinions on whether aql comes first or chastity comes first. So just to keep that in mind. And some scholars, they also debated whether it's, okay, let's just leave it at that. I don't want to confuse you. All right, so when we come with chastity, that is family. When we're talking about family, and somebody might ask, well, what do you mean by family? Well, family means the source and the origin of mankind. Man and woman getting married and making family. Protecting the foundation of family and protecting the foundation to instills the different parts of the family is actually part of chastity. Meaning what as well? Well, that also includes the person's honor, and any type of sexual relations outside of marriage in Islam is considered as if you are harming the foundation of family, and therefore you are harming the foundation of man's existence, and therefore you're committing a major crime. So in Islam, if you go against any of these categories, whether we're talking about deen or nafs, aql, mal, chastity, family, etc., that would be considered the major crime. Let's go for wealth. Wealth, in where it's protecting people's welfare, and welfare to mean people's property, making sure that people have a safe property, their property is safe, their property is secure, and also in the way that that wealth is spent. That wealth is spent to bring about prosperity and justice within the community, acts as part of the principles and legal maxims in Sharia. Now, this is really important to mention. You know, I was asked one time by a priest, and he said, how do you define sin? So I said, well, in order to define sin, you really have to understand what is the principle. What is a principle? What is, when you want to act with integrity, what does it mean to have a principle? What does it mean to act with integrity? And here in Islam, I said, well, once you go against people's spiritualities and the common good in order to help people define right and wrong, well, then this is considered a crime. Once you go against people's lives, that's considered a crime. You harm people's minds in their education. You're giving them false education. You're indoctrinating them. You're brainwashing them to, do wrong things, well, that is considered a crime. So what is happening right now in a lot of schools is indoctrinating the children, indoctrinating the masses to believe in a lot of, not a lot of those matters that are against principles that would be considered a crime. And the same thing when we're talking about the health. If you're, convincing people, or you're harming people or selling people that those substances that are harming their mental health, whether that includes alcohol, etc., then you're actually right now considered committing a crime. When you're, whether you are promoting or whether you're practicing anything that harms the foundation of family, or people's sexual rights to be preserved, then rights, what we mean by sexual rights, meaning that nobody would act outside of, between husband and wife, outside of husband and wife relations, and anybody that transgresses the limits, husband and wife, male, female, anybody that transgresses the rights of these two, husband and wife, is actually considered to have committed something haram, and considered to have actually committed a crime. When we look at those legal maxims, we always keep those in mind, because every single order, every single ruling in Islam actually goes back to this acronym and these legal maxims, or Sharia maxims in Sharia. Every single matter. There is no ruling that goes outside of these 5 categories. Not any ruling. No matter where you go, it is going to go back to these points. But here's one thing. The closer it is to harm and have a direct cause or a direct impact on harming these categories, that would be called haram. But the things that may lead, all right, the things that may lead to that particular harm can also be haram. But then if something might lead, okay, so let's do this. Now we're going to go into a number of different things. If something always leads, okay, always leads those matters to becoming harming, da'iman, always. It always leads to somehow having a direct impact in securing these principles. If it always has it, then it's going to be haram. All right? Then if most of the times that it will always, then we would say, okay, if most of the times it will lead to endangering one of these maxims, then we're going to say, okay, this is haram, but are we able to put conditions to make sure that people are, getting some space, but with the conditions to make sure that it's maintaining a certain direction, meaning a certain direction to preserving them staying away from harming these points. Then there is the final part, which is there's adatan or ghaliban, all right? Then there's that part where most probably, almost always, this will lead to harming those maxims, then that would actually be haram. So would we look at these situations where is it always, is it most of the times, in other words, the high likely, more likely, or is it adatan, usually, that leads to this haram? So with cases of usually, we will put in conditions to make sure that it doesn't lead to this area, but these two are going to be haram. All right? So we would look at those principles and we would look at the action, and then we're going to say, well, let's see what and how this is going to lead in endangering those different matters. Now, remember what we said most of the times, and by the way, the Most of the times the always, etc., was actually something that was mentioned by Shatibi, who's one of one of the Maliki scholars. The other references that a scholar might consider, and this is really important to mention, because the other issues that scholars might consider, what's called maslaha mursala, which is a farther benefit that we're considering here. But even though sometimes, it may consider, there could be a text that we need to, in that situation, probably not use that text just because there's a bigger benefit. Let's give an example. Umar ibn al-Khattab, when during Amir Ramada, during the time when there was a famine, a man stole to eat. So Umar ibn al-Khattab did not implement the ruling and had sariqa, the stealing uh, uh, punishment, simply because he felt, well, these people are right now facing a famine, and although we do have a text, but preserving these people's lives, in other words, this person stole to eat. And let's go back to this category. Did the person steal for the sake of getting rich? No. This person stole to preserve his life. He was facing hunger. He wanted to feed his family. So in that situation, even though he actually stole, but because of al-maslaha al-mursala, because of this being more important, we're going to not implement the ruling of sariqa at then, the ruling of stealing, because he was actually trying to preserve his family's life, and that's why he stole. I'm not going to go through each and every single one of them, but I want to definitely go for the culture and tradition one. This is the most one that people would ask about, because they would think that, no, we always have to say that tradition and culture, and let's separate tradition and culture and all that. And there seems to be that war to be waged at culture all the time. Not too fast. Not always is a culture to be disregarded or to be put on a different area, because many times culture can act as a way to communicate between a group of people, because it acts as that norm that people have become acquainted with, and it organized their lifestyle. So if a culture, if a specific culture does not contradict the text, this is really important to mention. So when do we consider the culture to being a reference in Islamic law? Is number one, it does not contradict, if it does not contradict a text. So you cannot say, well, right now we've got an American culture here that polygamy is haram and it's illegal, therefore it would be haram. No, because the culture, even if it is within the non-Muslim culture, even if it's a law here, that does not make it as invalidating the text, because the text, you don't invalidate or you don't ignore a text because of a new culture, especially if that culture is not Muslim. So it's still going to be considered halal. Yes, it is illegal according to the American Constitution or American law, but it does not mean that it is haram in Islam, even if the culture says otherwise. So in order for any culture to be considered, that is one, only if it does not contradict a text. Two, so now one, it doesn't contradict a text. Number two is that culture goes in parallel with, remember the maxims that we were talking about, which is the acronym DNAIM, the Deen, the Nafs, the Aql, the Ird, the Man. You got to memorize that like your own name. All right. So when we look at that, and when we want to consider the tradition and the culture, in where we would consider, is this a Muslim culture, and whose culture are we talking about? And that's, of course, when we look at those items. Well, with culture, it is something that we would have to still keep in mind. And that's why, especially in marriage, when sisters come to me and they say, well, I want to know what Islam says. I don't want to know what culture is. There's absolutely no way that I can tell you that everything in detail in marriage, that there's something that we have in text, because the text itself would actually tell you to go back to your culture. And in cases where, for example, the couples are getting into a dispute and sometimes in marital problems, and then she would go to the sheikh is going to say, well, go to an imam that comes from your culture. Because culture acts as this silent communication way of communicating between a society. So that's why we would say, well, go back to, if you're Somali, go back to a Somali scholar. If you are Moroccan, go back to a Moroccan scholar to help you understand and interpret that hidden communication that you all somehow agree on without you realizing. Let's go for the other part, which is the blocking the means of evil. I know I put a shaitan's face right there, but when we look at the blocking the means of evil, this is considered as 2/3 of Islam. Because in Islam, when we talk about blocking the means of evil, remember when we said what leads to haram always is going to be haram. What leads to haram most of the times, that is going to be, so most of the times, most times that is going to be haram. What leads to sometimes, often, etc., well, barely is not going to be haram. Then, adatan, there's a possibility, then we would look into, well, let us put those dawabit, those conditions, let's regulate to see, can we regulate and say, well, you can practice it, but there's a chance that you might go the wrong way. So can we use those conditions to make sure that's going the right way or not? So that's when 2/3, where did we get the blocking means of evil as a legal maxim or as a reference in Islam? Well, we got it from even the hadith, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even said, you didn't put Shaitan's face picture because we don't know how he looks like. All right, this is a comment that somebody said that I should not be putting Shaitan's face. This is actually PowerPoint itself, just putting these things, and it designs it by itself. All right, so 2/3 of the Islamic rulings, we see it that in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid that we would um, uh, swear or use illicit comments on the mushrikeen, even though they're polytheists, even though they're not even Muslim. But we should not curse or even speak ill about their gods. And the reason why the ayah actually specified, it actually clarified that the reason why is because they could act in an ignorant way and actually swear to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So looking at the consequence is actually part of those legislating items that we as Muslims would consider. So looking at the consequence and what that might lead to is actually part of Islam. So having that being said, when we're looking at Sadd al-Dhara'i', this goes 2/3 of Islam. 2/3 of Islam is all about Sadd al-Dhara'i'. Why is lowering your gaze part of Islam? Well, because of how it might lead to exciting and provoking certain feelings inside, and then probably affecting your behavior and probably affecting your own principle, integrity, whatever it is. And therefore, you would have to limit your gaze and what you're looking at in order to make sure that you control it when it's easier for you to control. And the list goes on and on. Every single ruling actually relates to one of those 5 major items that we had talked about. Now, the other part, which is qawl al-sahabi. So the prophet, one of the prophet's companions, remember we said it would be an athar, All right, it would be an athar, and we would look at, well, what were the reports? What were the reports that the Prophet's companions had said? We would look at their reports, and some scholars considered that that is a stronger reference to go back to than actually researching other items. Now, the other part, which is shar'u man qablina, I was asked a few days ago, and scholars had different opinions on each and every single one of these, at least shar'u man qablina and al-urf, and how deep can it be. And by the way, just really fast, the science that studies these references and the variant opinions on how we understand these references and how we implement them is the science called usul al-fiqh. Right? If you don't have usul al-fiqh, you cannot be a scholar of fiqh. You have to have the fundamentals of fiqh to learn how to understand those texts and put them in a place where you could make a legislature. If you don't have usul al-fiqh, you're not going to be able to do this. All right? And that's why learning usul al-fiqh depends very much on lugha arabiya, depends very much on learning the means of different rulings and etc. Now, the other part, which is shar'u man qablina, the previous prophets' legislatures. What does that mean? A few days ago, I was asked a question. The question said, it was a revert. She became Muslim, and she said, well, here we know that Asya bint Muzahim, Asya, the Pharaoh's wife, she stayed married to her husband. So if this lady becomes Muslim, can she stay married to her husband? Because, hey, here's my evidence that that Asya herself stayed with the Pharaoh, even though he obviously never became Muslim. So can we use that as a reference? The answer is no. So that could have been shar'u man qablina, that could have been the previous prophet's legislature, but this is not our legislature. Not everything in the previous legislatures is or can be applied during our time. Think of Prophet Adam alayhi salam. The siblings were getting married to one another. Well, that was because they were the only people there. All right. So we can't use that as a justification to justify incest and say, well, during the time of Prophet Adam, this used to happen. So shar'u man qablina would, in Islam, it's basically abrogating and what is called naskh. All right. In Islam, the Sharia of Prophet ﷺ abrogated all the previous legislatures that came in previous times, and that abrogation would help us learn what we might accept certain shar'u man qablina. There are some things that if in Islam it was not clearly abrogating a certain matter, then we can use that as a legislature. We can use that as a reference to say, well, here's Prophet Musa alayhi salam, and it was her father, his wife, her father. In other words, her father-in-law was the one that said, I'm going to get you married to one of my daughters, and it was really the man that proposed to Prophet Musa, not the other way. All right, so we can use that because in Islam there is nothing that abrogated that being permissible. So just a number of things. So we're going to end right here. If anybody has any questions, we're going to continue next week, inshallah. A number of different things we're going to talk about next week. We're really getting close, well, almost. To finishing those slides, because down the road, just a secret, okay? Yes, secret, and putting it on Facebook. Just a secret, we're actually later going to do sharh for the book Barahin al-Nubuwwah. The book Barahin al-Nubuwwah, which is a book about the miracles of the Prophet ﷺ, the evidences about the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ, and so forth. So stay tuned. So we only have, let me see how many slides. We're on slide 86, and we have until 182. And the more we go further, the easier it becomes. And inshallah, once we finish this, we'll go into a different issue. Inshallah, I'm excited. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yeah, I will be giving out the handouts, inshallah. We had like, okay, so here we had Sahaba, like story of Umar when he went to look for a husband for his daughter Hafsa. Well, yeah, well, of course, we've got different examples, but uh, yeah, we um, we can also use, shar'u man qablina. Some scholars will use shar'u man qablina if it is not mansukh, if it was not abrogated, and they will use that as a reference. So when we want to put in any evidence to prove that such a matter is halal haram, the most thing that I feel that Muslims of today should learn about Islam are two main sciences: the science of hadith and the science of usul al-fiqh. Why these two sciences? Because when these two sciences, usul al-fiqh and ilm al-hadith, when those two sciences were I would say were viewed as an elite and something that we don't need, that's when a lot of the Muslims got lost in learning what acts as a reference. So I'm not here, tafsir is my favorite, but many times when Muslims would engage in tafsir without having the resources to learn how to legislate, then it becomes more of a narrative. And that's our problem today, is many times they don't know what acts as a reference and what acts as a resource. And that's why they start becoming an easy target to a lot of the narratives, because they don't have the foundation to know how to derive the ruling or even what acts as a resource in Islam. If we don't have that foundation, that epistemology, it starts from the foundation. If you don't have the foundation, you're going to be an easy target to all those narratives, and you're going to be gliding in your emotions and the narratives and etc. And you would think that, oh, I'm actually here being a good Muslim, without you realizing that it was all more of your self manipulation. You're manipulating yourself and thinking and attributing those legislatures to Islam, when in reality it was more of a made up interpretation that you had made up because you didn't know the keys on how to go back to the resources. If you don't know which resources to get, you're going to end up like Hatibulay. You're going to end up, it's like somebody that is in the middle of the night going to hunt, and if they can't see anything, they're going to be taking so many different things, and probably even end up taking burning coal and thinking of it as light. Nas'Allah al-afwa al-afiyah. All right. Please explain. Okay, so here's a question. Explain illah. So somebody said explain illah. So illah, there's illah would not be the wisdom, because illah would mean the actual reasoning why such a matter had the conclusion of such a ruling. All right, so the actual reason, not the wisdom. The difference between wisdom and illah, the wisdom acts as more of, we would derive kind of like it's not, what is the word? It's matata, meaning it's very elastic. It's not firm, and that's why wisdom can't act as the reason for that ruling, because the wisdom is different. It can be viewed differently. It must be a matter that is not an elastic, meaning we all agree that this is the reason for that by looking at the text. The text will point out the reason why such a thing is halal or such a thing is haram, and then that acts as the illah. Now, most of the times, we would look at the main reason why hijab is obligatory is not because to protect women. That's a wisdom. But the main reason is really because there was a text that is giving the order. All right. But there we could get a wisdom. So the wisdom behind something is more of what is the word that I could use? It's the main key word. The main key word is it's not mundabat. What is the word mundabat? So it's mundabat, meaning that it's preserving it from different interpretations. Okay. So al-illa, it's not an elastic relative description, but it has to be something where it can be pointed out and clearly pointed out. So that's the illah. Does group ritual look like doing ibadah based on qiyas? Yeah, well, for group ritual, the group rituals in ibadah, you can't do qiyas in ibadah. So you can't say, well, just like we pray salah together for salat al-jama'ah, let's also do another type of dhikr and actually sit together and start reading al-Fatiha together and start reading Quran together and perform it in that way, because that would actually al-ibadah is mawquf. All right, let me use that word. Ibadah is mawquf, meaning when we come to ritual, you can only perform a ritual if that ritual was mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ. There is no qiyas on it. All right? Al-asl fil ibadah at-tawaqquf. Al-asl fil ibadah, that al-asl generally, the main ruling in ritual is that you should not do unless you have an evidence to do. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to go into a bid'ah, then you're going to go into an innovation, because then you're making up your own religion, then you're making up your own ritual. All right, so ibadat are generally tawqifiyya. All right, ibadat tawqifiyya would mean that they are all based on text, so they are textual. All right, you can't form your own ibadah and say, I've got my qiyas. They have to have textual references. So here's another question. Like durood as a group, reciting 100 times a certain surah, like what we discussed before. So when we talk about ritual and ibadah, you know what? How about that? That's a whole different topic. Maybe we'll discuss down. I know that there is something that we're going to discuss down the road relating to bid'ah and stuff. So we'll get to that inshallah next in the following, not next week, but in the following slides inshallah. Wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad, and jazakumullah khairan everybody for attending. Assalamu alaikum.